The document lay on the reading table as though it had always been there, as though it had been waiting. It was a single folio sheet, folded once and sealed with dark wax that had been broken long ago, broken by hands other than the ones that were meant to receive it, and the wax had dried in the attitude of a wound that would not close. The ink on its outer face had faded to the color of weak tea, but the letters of the name written there were still legible in the gray morning light that fell through the library's one unshuttered window. Elspeth Vane, née Corwin. Not Lady Ashmore, not the widow. Elspeth Corwin, the name she had been born with, the name she had not used in 4 years and 11 months, the name that belonged to a person she had been before a particular April morning when her life had taken a turning she had not fully understood until considerably after she had passed through it. The name that someone had known to write. Beside the document sat a candle burned to almost nothing, its wick drowned in its own pooled wax, cold now, which meant it had been lit some hours ago, the night before, perhaps, or in the very early hours of the morning by someone who had wanted the document found after dark and had not accounted for the fact that dawn would come and the room would be entered by ordinary light and the candle would have burned itself to uselessness by then. She noted this. She noted it because it told her something about the person who had left the document, which was that they were not entirely composed in their planning, which was in turn the first useful thing she knew about them. The room beyond the table was in considerable disorder, shelves half empty, books stacked in uneven columns on the floor, 2 glass cases standing with their doors ajar, their contents absent in a way that was clearly not accidental. Volumes had been pulled and not replaced. Papers had been gathered up and removed, the pale ghost of their outlines still marking the shelves where they had rested. The whole of the east wing of Ashmore House had been given over to this kind of rough efficiency in the days since the funeral, and the library had suffered most. But the table was clear. Someone had cleared the table deliberately and carefully, had set the document and the candle on its surface, and arranged them with the attention one gives to a message one means to be legible. Elspeth stood in the doorway for a long moment before she entered. This was a habit she had developed in the years of her marriage, the habit of pausing at thresholds, of reading a room before committing her body's weight to it, and she had not been able to shed it in the months since her husband's death, though she was no longer entirely certain she wished to shed it. Caution had served her. It was still serving her. She looked at the room carefully, the way she had learned to look at rooms, not for what was there, but for what was not, and for the space between the things that were there, which was where the truth of a room usually lived. The room was empty of people. The document sat on the table. She entered and she closed the door behind her, and she crossed to the table in 4 steps and stood before the folded sheet of paper and read her name on its outer face once, twice, a third time, the way one reads a word that seems almost familiar but not quite, that sits at the edge of recognition like something seen in bad light. Then she picked it up. The broken wax caught briefly on her thumb. She opened it. She had not intended to come to the library that morning. She had not been to the library at all in the 12 days since her husband's funeral, though she had thought about it often, had thought about it with the particular compound feeling of someone who loves a place and knows they are losing it and cannot decide whether the approach of the loss makes the place more precious or simply more painful to inhabit. The library had been hers in a way that few things in Ashmore House had been hers. Not legally, not officially, not in any way that a document would record or a solicitor would acknowledge, but practically and daily, and in the way that matters most to a person who is living a life rather than managing an estate. The library had been the room she went to when she needed to be herself, which had been more often than anyone outside the marriage would have guessed. Lord Ashmore, the old lord, the first one, the husband, had not been a reader. He had had many qualities, some of them estimable in certain lights, but reading was not among them. He had left the library to its accumulated dust and its uneven shelves and its 4 generations of accumulated Ashmore enthusiasms, which ran heavily to sporting chronicles, estate management, natural philosophy of the more accessible sort, and one unexplained alcove of German mystical theology that she had always suspected predated the Ashmores entirely and simply had not been moved. She had gone to the library. She had catalogued it in her 3rd year of marriage, with no authority and no purpose beyond her own satisfaction, filling 3 ledgers with a system she had invented, and that no one had asked for and that had given her. In the making of it, something that she had needed badly, evidence that she could impose an order on something, that she could look at chaos and reduce it to a legible whole. The ledgers were gone now. She had seen that immediately, on her first cautious entry 3 days ago. The ledgers were among the things that someone had decided were sufficiently associated with her to be removed. The pettiness of it had startled her almost as much as the act itself. She had, in fact, come to the library this particular morning because of what had happened 3 evenings before, in the study. Lord Aubrey had received her, the second reception, following the first in which the terms had been laid out with such polished economy, because she had requested it, which she understood was itself a kind of error in his calculation of her. He had not expected her to request anything. He had expected, she thought, the widow's retreat, the gradual quiet, self-effacing diminishment of a woman who had absorbed the shape of her situation and was in the process of accommodating herself to it. That was what widows did, when they were sensible widows. Widows who understood their position and had no resources to complicate it. He had been, in the first meeting, almost kind in the manner that very powerful men can afford to be kind, a warmth that costs them nothing and communicates, underneath its pleasantness, the absolute confidence of a person who holds all the instruments and knows it. The politeness had been the instrument. She had recognized this without being able at the time to articulate it clearly. She was articulating it clearly now, in the memory of the study and its arrangement, the desk placed to maximize his elevation relative to her seated position, the light from the window behind him falling in a way that shadowed his face while illuminating hers. Details so deliberate that she found it difficult to believe they were unconscious and so subtle that she could not have named them at the time without appearing absurd. He had asked in the second meeting what she needed. He had offered again the tea she did not drink. He had leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man entirely at home in his own circumstances, and looked at her with an expression of patient attention that was, she understood another instrument, the expression that made a person feel they were being genuinely heard while being, in fact, being managed. She had told him she wished to use the library for the remainder of her time, to complete the cataloging she had begun and never finished. He had agreed immediately with a generosity that was also easy. Of course, the library was entirely at her disposal. She was welcome to anything that was of use to her. And she had thanked him and stood and left. And on the landing at the top of the stairs, she had stood very still for a moment, with her hand on the banister and something in her chest that felt like the word yes spoken to no one in particular. She had gone to the library the following morning. She had found the document before 10 o'clock. The document in her hands was dated 14 months before the death of Lord Ashmore. It was a letter of the formal kind, the kind that belongs not to correspondence but to the machinery of legal instruments, to the world of records and registries and things set down in the permanent present tense of official language. It had been written by a solicitor she did not know, a man named Theodore Wicks, at an address in the city. It pertained to a property. It pertained specifically to the house in which she had grown up, the Corwin property, her mother's house, the house her mother had died in 3 years before Elspeth's marriage, and that had come to her on her mother's death as the last remaining piece of a family that had been diminishing for a long time. She had understood, in the weeks before her marriage, that the property had been placed in trust for her as part of the settlement, the formal arrangement made between Lord Ashmore and the family's solicitor. The arrangement, she had been told, was standard and appropriate and that she need not trouble herself with the particulars of. She had been 22. She had believed the men who told her how things worked. She had thanked them and signed what she was given to sign, and had looked forward, with the sincere and uninformed hopefulness of the young, to her future. The letter in her hands told her what her future had been built on. The property, according to the letter, had not been placed in trust for her. It had been transferred outright to Lord Ashmore, with her signature attested and the date and the full form of the transfer executed as though she had understood what she was doing and consented to it clearly. She did not remember signing a transfer document. She had a good memory. She would have remembered. The letter referenced this transfer as completed, confirmed the entry at the registry, and expressed, in the careful language of a man who was doing something that might later require careful explanation, certain concerns on the part of the sender that the terms had not been communicated with full transparency to the relevant party. The relevant party. She read the phrase. She set the letter down on the table and stood with her hands flat on its surface and breathed very deliberately. In through the nose, slowly, out through the mouth. Slowly. The way she had taught herself to breathe in the years when breathing was something she had to remember to do rather than something that simply happened. 1 minute passed, 2. Then she picked up the letter, folded it exactly along its existing crease, and pressed it flat against her chest, inside the front of her dress, between her skin and the dark wool of her morning clothes, where it lay warm and secret and absolutely still. She stood up straight. She was very, very composed. There is a quality to certain kinds of anger that resembles, on the surface, its opposite. It does not announce itself with heat or volume. It arrives instead like a change in temperature in a deep room, barely perceptible at first, and then unmistakable, and then simply the condition of the room, the baseline by which everything else is measured. It strips away what is decorative and leaves what is structural. It makes the walls visible. Elspeth felt it arrive now and stood and let it settle and waited for it to become something she could think through rather than something that was thinking for her. She was good at this. She had been made good at this over years. She had learned to receive the thing that would break a person with less practice and to hold it until it became something she could use, which was not a quality she would have chosen for herself, but that she had come to understand was among the more durable things the years had given her. She had known for a long time. She understood now that she had known it for years. Since a particular conversation in the 3rd year of her marriage when she had asked to see the trust documents and been told they were in the city and would take time to retrieve and had never seen them, and had asked again in the 5th year and been told the same thing with the same ease, the same mild assurance, the same implication that her asking was a small misunderstanding rather than a reasonable inquiry. She had known, in the way that knowledge sometimes lives in a person before they have the words for it, before they have the framework in which it can be named, that the terms of her marriage were not what she had been told they were. She had known it and not known it simultaneously, which is the condition of a person who suspects the truth and also cannot yet afford to look at it directly, and who therefore constructs a set of intermediate positions. It is possible, it might be, I may have misunderstood, that allow them to continue functioning while the suspicion accumulates its weight somewhere below the level of the daily. She was no longer below the level of the daily. She could look at it now, plainly, in the gray morning light of the library she had been given as a consolation, and that had turned out to be something else entirely. The property was gone. Her mother's house was gone, the house in which her mother had grown old and died and in which Elspeth had been a child, without knowing that childhood was a thing that ended, and that what came after it needed to be managed carefully, and that not everyone around you was managing it in your interest. The income from her father's bequest, she would need to find out about that. There was something in the letter that suggested the irregularity was not limited to the property, that it was more comprehensive, that it had been going on for longer than the single document in her hands could account for, was gone, or had been going, quietly and continuously, for years. The ledgers in which she had catalogued the library were gone. She was being given a room in which to exist for a limited period, and had been made to feel that this was a form of generosity. And someone with access to this room and knowledge of her name before her, marriage and apparent familiarity with the shape of what lay hidden here, had left a document on a table and lit a candle beside it and gone away to wait. She breathed out slowly. She thought where to begin. And then she thought the thing that was simpler and more useful. You begin where you are. You begin with what you have. You have a letter and a broken seal and a name and the cold light of this particular morning, and you begin, the name Wickes required care to follow. She could not ask Lord Aubrey's household staff, the new household, the quickly assembled machinery of the son's tenure, which had proven efficient and loyal in ways that made certain inquiries inadvisable. She could not consult the house's records directly, because the house's records had been among the first things the new lord had placed under his solicitor's management, and the solicitor had a small, cold face that she did not trust. She went instead to the market town 7 miles away, where she had been several times in the past weeks under the unremarkable pretext of settling certain small practical accounts, and where the woman who ran the stationer's shop had known her since the early days of her marriage and was, in Elspeth's careful assessment, the kind of woman who noticed everything and said nothing until she was asked directly, at which point she could be remarkably exact. The stationer's woman, Mrs. Holt, a widow herself, compact and watchful, with a shop that smelled of paper and linseed, confirmed that a solicitor named Wicks had maintained rooms above a counting house on the lower street, and that he had died some 3 years ago, and that she believed there was a daughter. Constance was the name, Constance Wickes. She lived in a house behind the church, a house with a blue door, which Mrs. Holt had no particular reason to know except that she noticed blue doors, as she noticed most things, and filed them away for when they might prove useful. The blue door opened on the second knock. The woman who stood behind it was perhaps 60, with gray-streaked hair pinned without particular art and the direct, undeflected gaze of someone who has been waiting for a specific person to arrive and is not surprised to find that they have. Constance Wicks did not extend pleasantries. She looked at Elspeth for a moment, and then she stepped back from the door and said simply, "Come in." Then, the house was small and clean and full of papers. Papers in ordered stacks on the table, papers in boxes on the shelves, papers with the careful weight of things that have been kept deliberately, not accumulated carelessly. Constance Wicks sat across from her and said, "I left it for you. I was my father's clerk for 30 years, and I knew where it had been placed, and I knew the shape of the thing well enough to know that you were the person who needed to find it. I waited until Lord Ashmore was dead, because living he would have seen to any exposure before it could be of use. And I waited until the old house was being cleared, because clearing is when things come to light or are buried for good. And I was not going to let this one be buried." She said it plainly, as though it were a statement of fact, which it was. "How long have you known?" Elspeth asked. Constance looked at her steadily. "Long enough," she said. "My father knew the whole of it. He was not a bad man. He was a man who became involved in something that moved faster than his conscience did, and by the time his conscience caught up, there was not much he could do except keep the records and refuse to destroy them. He kept everything. Carbon copies of every letter, every instruction, every transaction. He told me where they were before he died. He told me to keep them and to know what to do with them when the time came." She paused. "I am not a lawyer," she added, with a precision that was itself a kind of legal clarity. "But I know what these documents say. I know what they describe. I know that what was done to you has a name, and that its name is not misfortune." Elspeth sat very still. She was aware of the particular feeling of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time, and has just unexpectedly been offered assistance, and who is not yet certain how to receive it. "What do you want?" she asked. Constance's expression did not change. "I want what my father should have done while it could still have helped you more," she said. "That is all." The box that Constance Wicks set on the table between them was made of dark wood, approximately the size of a year's correspondence, with a brass clasp that had been polished recently. Inside it were papers, many papers, arranged with a clerk's precision, dated and ordered and annotated in a small, controlled hand that she understood to be the father's. She carried the box back to the room she had rented in the market town, a room above a draper's shop, small and adequate, with a window that looked out onto the street, and she sat with the box on the table, and she opened it, and she began to read. She read through the afternoon and into the evening, and then by candlelight, until her eyes refused her. And what she read assembled itself piece by piece, in her mind with the terrible clarity of a thing that has been known in fragments and is now becoming whole. The property transfer was confirmed, in triplicate, in the records and the correspondence. The income from her father's bequest, income she had never seen, income that had been collected quarterly and deposited into an account that bore her name but that she had never been informed existed, was accounted for in 7 years of entries, each one precise, none of them accompanied by any communication to her. A letter from Theodore Wicks to Lord Ashmore, dated in the 4th year of her marriage, expressed in the careful language of a man who was managing his own professional risk certain reservations about the ongoing arrangement, reservations that Lord Ashmore had apparently responded to in a way that the carbon copy of his reply described as reassurance. She read the copy of the reply. The reassurance was fluent and convincing and entirely without sincerity. She had heard that tone. She recognized it. She had lived alongside it for years without being able to name precisely what it was, and there was something else. Among the later papers, near the bottom of the box, there was a set of notes in the father's hand. Notes that were not formal correspondence, but something closer to a private record. A working through of something the old man had apparently been assembling in the final years of his life. The notes pertained to the will. They pertained to the original will. The will that Lord Ashmore had made in the early years of his marriage to Elspeth. The will that had been amended twice in the final year of his life. The father's notes described a clause in the original will, a clause that bore directly on the Corwin property, a clause that Wicks had believed was the key to the whole arrangement, the key not only to understanding what had been done, but to demonstrating that the subsequent amendments had been made in order to conceal it. The notes were fragmentary in places, the handwriting of a man recording something faster than it was fully formed. But the shape of what they pointed to was clear enough. If the original will could be found, the first version before either amendment, the clause it contained would make visible what the amendments had been designed to hide. And the original will, if it was anywhere, was in Ashmore House. She was, for another 2 weeks, still nominally present in Ashmore House. She had been given the library as a domain. She had not yet finished cataloging what had been left there. She went back. She arrived at Ashmore House on a Thursday morning and was received at the door by the housekeeper, a woman named Partridge, who had been in the house's service for 20 years, and who had treated Elspeth with consistent, impersonal courtesy throughout the marriage and with something warmer and less easy to name since the funeral. Partridge did not ask why she had come. She took her coat and said, without prelude, "The library is as you left it, my lady." The form of address, which was no longer accurate technically, but which Partridge used with what felt like quiet deliberateness, was the only acknowledgment she offered of anything out of the ordinary. Elspeth went to the library. She spent the morning there visibly, working through the remaining stacks of books with the unhurried attention of a woman doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. And in the afternoon she began, with the same unhurried attention, to go over the room more carefully. She had thought about the north wall. She had thought about it at length in the nights since reading the father's notes, and she had returned to something she had noticed in the 4th year of her cataloging and set aside because she had no framework for it. The wall behind the shelving on the north side of the room was 3 inches thicker than the wall on the south side. She had noted this as an architectural curiosity, the kind of thing old houses offered regularly, and had not considered it further. She considered it now. She pressed the shelving. She examined the joins between the panels. She worked along the wall with a patience that she had learned over 5 years of a marriage that had required patience as a constant operating condition. And in the mid-afternoon, when the light from the window had shifted to lay long across the floor, she found the cabinet, a flush panel that released on pressure at a specific point low on its left edge, swinging silently on hinges so well made they had not stiffened in what she estimated was at least several decades. The cabinet was not large. It contained 3 items, a small locked box that she did not attempt to open, a collection of letters tied with ribbon that she left in place, and a folded document, thick paper, well preserved, written in a hand that was not Lord Ashmore's but that bore his signature on the last page. She took the document to the window. She sat on the floor, back against the cold lower casement, and she read it in the remaining afternoon light, steadily and carefully, beginning to end. The clause was there. It was in the 14th paragraph of the original will, a will which, she could see clearly by comparing the dates and the terms, had preceded the amendments by almost a year, and it was as the father's notes had described it and more. The clause stated that the Corwin property, which Lord Ashmore acknowledged had been transferred to him as part of the marriage settlement, was to be held in beneficial trust for Elspeth during her lifetime, reverting to the Corwin family line, or in the absence of surviving Corwin heirs, to Elspeth outright, in the event of her widowhood, and that this beneficial interest was to be recorded and registered with the relevant authorities within 90 days of the will's execution. It had not been recorded. It had never been registered. The subsequent amendments to the will, the first one, 18 months before his death, and the second one, which had apparently been executed with some urgency in the final weeks, had removed the clause entirely. Removed it, and removed with it any record in the official will of the beneficial arrangement, so that what remained was a will that made no reference to the property, and a transfer document that recorded a simple and outright gift, and a young widow who had been told that things were as they were, and had had no reason and no means to know otherwise. She sat on the floor with the document in her hands and the light shifting around her and felt, for the first time since the morning she had found the letter on the table, something that was not quite peace but was adjacent to it. The feeling of a person who has found the last piece of something and can now see the whole. She folded the original will very carefully along its existing creases. She pressed it against her chest, and it lay against the earlier letter. The two documents flat together in the dark between her skin and her mourning clothes, and she sat for a long time in the failing light, and then she stood, and she closed the cabinet, and she left the library. She left Ashmore House on a Tuesday morning, 4 days before Lord Aubrey's deadline, with her trunk and her hat box and the flat, warm pressure of the documents against her chest. And she did not look back as the carriage went down the drive. Lord Aubrey saw her from his study window. He had watched her in the weeks of her remaining tenure with the detached attention of a man who does not expect to be surprised and had not been, or had not appeared to be. He was as difficult to read as his father had been in certain moods, which she had always considered a family resemblance that spoke to something more deliberate than inheritance. He had seen her come and go from the library. He had noted, she suspected, that she had stayed longer than the task required. He had not questioned it, because questioning her would have required acknowledging that there was something to question, and acknowledgement was not his instrument. He preferred the silence that assumed its own sufficiency. She let him have the silence. She carried the documents south in a plain canvas bag and arrived at Constance Wicks's blue door in the late afternoon and knocked twice, as she had been told to, and Constance opened the door and looked at her face and said only, "You found it?" "Yes," Elspeth said. "Come in," said Constance, and stood back. And a third person was already seated at the small table inside, a woman of perhaps 45, with dark, close-set eyes and an expression of focused attention that was entirely professional, who rose when Elspeth entered and said her name, Margaret Solvay, and said she was a solicitor, and said, "I have been asked by Miss Wickes to hear what you have to tell me." "I have been doing this kind of work for 16 years. I should like to see what you have brought." Elspeth sat down. She placed the canvas bag on the table. She removed the documents and laid them flat, the original will and the letter, and she opened them carefully and smoothed them and said, "I'll tell you everything from the beginning." And she did. The process that followed had the quality of all such processes, long and painstaking and requiring a patience that was different from the patience of endurance, which she was very practiced at, and more like the patience of construction, of putting something together carefully, stone by stone, making sure of each piece before adding the next. Margaret Solvay was exacting and honest with her, which she appreciated beyond what she could have explained, because honesty had been a thing rationed in her experience, and she had learned to value it the way people value water when they are not sure of their next source. The case was not simple. The case was never going to be simple, because simple was not the territory they were in. They were in the territory of documents and registries, and the slow, imperfect machinery of a system that did not always move toward justice, but could be directed that way by people who knew the levers. Margaret knew the levers. She knew also when to use them and when to wait, which was its own form of knowledge, and perhaps the rarer one. She filed. She wrote letters. She requested records. She made 3 separate applications to 3 separate bodies over the course of 8 months, each one landing with the precise timing of a person who knows that the sequence matters as much as the content. Elspeth gave her testimony in writing, twice, once for the record, and once for a particular official whose position in the matter was lateral, but whose opinion carried a weight that the direct route did not. A complexity that Margaret explained in plain terms, and that she understood to be true to the nature of how things actually functioned, as opposed to how they were supposed to function. She did not find this disillusioning. She had been disillusioned earlier, over a longer period, about larger things, and the discovery that institutions moved sideways as often as they moved forward was simply the extension of something she already knew. There were, in this period, difficult weeks when the case stalled in some intermediary stage, when a response was delayed that Margaret had expected promptly, when the shape of the whole felt less like a building under construction and more like a ruin being slowly sorted. In these weeks she was not, she would admit privately, entirely composed. She had one evening in the 2nd month sat in her room above the draper's shop, and cried with a completeness that surprised her, not at the case or its delays, but at the years, which arrived all at once in the way that things one has kept carefully managed sometimes do. The morning she had come to Ashmore House as a new wife and stood in the entrance hall with her trunk and her hat box, and looked up at the ceiling and thought, "This is my life now," without yet knowing what that would mean. The slow accumulation of the library hours, the ledgers, the cataloging, the system she had made for herself in the only room that was entirely hers, the moment she had understood, without yet having the words, that the man she had married had decided what she was and was living accordingly, and that she had been given no vocabulary for arguing. She cried through all of this, and then she stopped, and she washed her face, and she went to bed. And in the morning she got up and went to Constance Wicks's house and sat at the small table and said, "Tell me again what the original will establishes. I want to hear it in plain language," Constance told her. She listened very carefully, the way she had always listened, with her whole attention, without interrupting, cataloging as she went. She went home and wrote for 2 hours in the new ledger. The week after was better. Most weeks were better in the end than the week before them. She lived in the room above the draper's shop, and she read, and she took walks, and she visited Constance Wicks, who became, in the course of the year, something that she was careful not to overname, but that she was grateful for, which was simply a person who knew the whole of the situation and treated her as someone with sense and withstanding, and from whose company she came away feeling not diminished, which was not a quality of human contact she had been reliably able to count on. She wrote letters to a former schoolfellow in another county who had remained kind. She went to church in the town, not from conviction but because it was a quiet hour and the light in the building was good in the morning. She kept new ledgers. The cataloging she had begun in Ashmore's library she did not continue. That project was over, its materials gone, its system intact in her memory but belonging now to a room she would not return to. But she began new ones, cataloging her own reading, her own thinking, the shape of what she was learning as the case moved and the year passed. The ledgers were not for anyone. They were simply hers, in the same way the original ledgers had been hers, and having them was a form of sufficiency. There was a cat, too, a gray cat that had arrived, uninvited and unannounced, through the window she had left open in the 5th week, and that had installed itself with the complete self-possession of an animal that has made a decision and sees no reason to revisit it. She had not named it for 2 weeks, on the theory that naming it would constitute a commitment she had not consciously chosen. By the end of the 3rd week she was calling it something, not quite a name, more a sound that the cat appeared to recognize. And by the end of the month she had stopped pretending that this was anything other than what it was, which was a small, warm, persistent thing that kept returning to her room with the reliable constancy of something that did not know enough about her situation to be discouraged by it. It slept on the end of her bed. In the evenings when the case weighed on her and the room felt small and the cost of the years felt close and heavy, it sat beside her on the chair and she felt its warmth against her side, and this was, she understood, not nothing. It was not a reparation. It was not justice. But it was real and warm and present, and it did not require her to perform composure or to manage her expressions or to make herself less than she was so that someone else could be comfortable. And there was a lesson in that, not a complicated lesson, not one that required the 3 new ledgers she had filled, but a lesson nonetheless, written in the simplest possible language, that the things which keep returning deserve to be received. The settlement was reached on a Wednesday in what had been a dry March, the kind of March that smells already of the spring it hasn't yet become. She was not present. She had been in her room, reading, with a cup of tea that had gone cold while she was not paying attention to it. And Constance arrived at 3 o'clock with Margaret behind her, and both of them came in without ceremony and sat down at the table with a precision that told her, before anyone spoke, that something had been resolved. She set her book down. She looked at their faces, which were careful and still in the particular way of people who are carrying a conclusion they have not yet decided how to deliver. Then Margaret said, "It is done. Not everything we asked for, but enough. The settlement's terms were not everything. They were never going to be everything. The law works in partial restorations, in measures of accountability that fall short of the actual weight of what was done." And she had made her peace with that, or rather, She had made her peace with the distance between what the law could do and what she needed it to do, which were different amounts, and had decided that the former was still worth having, even in the presence of the latter. What the settlement provided was a formal record of the irregularities, acknowledged and attested by a body whose acknowledgement carried official weight. Acknowledged, which was not a small word. Acknowledged was the difference between a wound that was seen and one that had been told repeatedly that it was not there. It provided a financial arrangement that returned to her a portion of what had been managed away over the course of 7 years. A smaller portion than the whole, but a real one. Sufficient for more than the modest maintenance Lord Aubrey had initially proposed, sufficient, in fact, for a house. And it provided a clause in the official record that named what had occurred in language that a person of Lord Aubrey Ashmore's position would feel as a permanent alteration in the temperature of his world. Even if no one outside a small circle of officials ever read it, he would know it was there. Men like Lord Aubrey always knew what was on record and where. She thought about Lord Aubrey when Margaret read her that clause. She thought about him not with anger. The anger had been useful, and she had let it be useful, and it had done its work, and she did not need it any longer. But with a feeling that was simpler and harder to articulate. The feeling of seeing something that had been in shadow finally in the right light, so that its true dimensions were apparent, not larger than she had feared, not smaller either, simply what it was. Lord Aubrey would continue. He would be careful, and he would continue, and she would continue as well. That was the shape of it. It was not symmetrical. She had stopped expecting symmetry some years ago, when she had understood that symmetry was not the world's operating principle, that the world operated on something more unruly and less satisfying than symmetry, and that the question was not whether the accounting balanced perfectly, but whether what you were left with was enough to live by. She had enough. She had more now than she had the morning she had entered the library and found what was waiting for her on the table. She nodded at Margaret. She said, "Thank you." Margaret nodded back. Constance looked out the window with an expression that was private and that Elspeth did not ask about. The afternoon light was still cold, but it was lengthening, as it does in March, as if practice for the longer evenings that are coming. A year passed. The spring came properly, with warmth in it, and the smell of things reviving in the garden behind the house she had moved to. A small house, the right size, with stone walls that held the morning cool and a garden that was in a state of productive wilderness that she had begun to address, with results that had surprised her with their pleasure. She was alone in the garden on the morning of the day that would mark, by her accounting, 1 year from the morning she had entered the library and found the document on the table, and she was kneeling in the earth with her hands in the soil, which were not clean, and which she was not particularly concerned about. And the light was the particular light of early spring mornings, surprised at itself, astonished at its own reach, when she heard the gate and stood and turned, and Constance Wicks came through it, and behind Constance came Margaret Solvay, and behind Margaret came a woman she did not recognize, young, perhaps 25, with dark eyes and an expression of something held carefully in check. Elspeth looked at the three of them and dusted the earth from her hands, an imperfect operation, and said, "What has happened?" Margaret said nothing bad, something unexpected. The young woman looked at her with the careful attention of someone who has rehearsed this moment and finds it, now that it has arrived, somewhat different from the rehearsal. She said, "I am the granddaughter of Theodore Wicks. My grandmother was his first wife before Constance's mother. He left a separate set of papers with her, papers he never told Constance about, that my grandmother passed to my mother and my mother passed to me. I didn't know what they were until I read about the settlement in the record, and then I understood." She held out a folder. "There is a second property," she said. "There is a second transfer. It is smaller and older, and I think you didn't know about it." Elspeth looked at her. She looked at Constance, who had the expression of a woman who has just received news she had not seen coming and has not yet decided what to do with it. She looked at Margaret, who looked back at her with the composed attention of a person who is already beginning to think about what comes next. She breathed in slowly. She breathed out. She looked down at her hands, which were still dirty from the garden, which were not still at all. They had never been still. She had only made them appear that way for so long, for so many rooms, in so many moments that required the performance of a composure. She was now, gradually and with some deliberateness, allowing herself to stop performing. She looked up at the young woman. She said, "Come inside. Tell me everything." They went in through the garden door, the four of them, into the small house where the morning light came through the east window and lay in a long, warm stripe across the kitchen floor. She put the kettle on. The folder was open on the table. The young woman's name was Clara, and she had her grandfather's handwriting, small and controlled, which Elspeth recognized now with the ease of long familiarity, the way one recognizes a voice. Constance sat with her hands folded and her expression calm in the way that calm can be a form of something else. Satisfaction, perhaps, or simply the feeling of a chain that has been long in the making, arriving at its final link. Margaret had already taken out her notebook. The kettle began. The morning was very bright outside, brighter than early spring usually managed. Bright with the particular quality of a light that has been a long time absent and has arrived at last with more warmth than it meant to. More warmth than could be entirely accounted for by the season. Elspeth looked at the folder, and at the papers inside it, and at the four women gathered in her kitchen in the morning light with the garden still visible through the window, still and green and quietly growing. She felt then something she could not have named precisely in the time when she was still learning to breathe deliberately, but that she could name now, not peace exactly, because peace was too simple a word for it, and not satisfaction. Because satisfaction implied an ending, and this was clearly not an ending. What she felt was more like the feeling of a thing that had been closed for a very long time beginning, with a sound that was barely a sound at all, to open. She poured the tea. She sat down. She said, "All right," from the beginning, and Clara began.